Before the Attorney General continues his opening statement, the tribunal, it will be more convenient. They think it will be more convenient that the tribunal shall sit from 10 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock with a break for 10 minutes in the middle of the morning, and that the tribunal should sit in the afternoon from 2 o'clock until 5 o'clock with a break for 10 minutes in the middle of the afternoon, and that there should be no open sitting of the tribunal on Saturday morning, as the tribunal has a very large number of applications by the defendant's counsel for witnesses and documents and other matters of that sort which it has to consider.
May it please the tribunal, when we broke off, I had been saying that the Nazi government was intent upon aggression, and all that had been taking place in regard to Danzig, the negotiations, the demands that were being made, was really no more than a cover and a pretext and excuse for further domination. As far back as September of 1938, plans for aggressive war against Poland, England, and France were well in hand. While Hitler at Munich was telling the world that the German people wanted peace, and that having solved the Czechoslovakian problem, Germany had no more territorial problems in Europe, the staffs of his armed forces were already preparing their plans. On the 26th of September of 1938, he had stated, "We have given guarantees to the states in the West. We have assured all our immediate neighbors of the integrity of their territory as far as Germany is concerned. That is no mere phrase. It is our sacred will. We have no interest whatever in a breach of the peace. We want nothing from these peoples." And the world was entitled to rely on those assurances. International cooperation is utterly impossible unless one can assume good faith in the leaders of the various states and honesty in the public utterances that they make. But in fact, within 2 months of that solemn and apparently considered undertaking, Hitler and his confederates were preparing for the seizure of Danzig. To recognize those assurances, those pledges, those diplomatic moves as the empty frauds that they were, one has to go back to inquire what was happening within the inner councils of the Reich from the time of the Munich Agreement. Written sometime in September of 1938 is an extract from a file on the reconstruction of the German Navy. Under the heading, "Opinion on the Draft Study of Naval Warfare against England," this is stated. 1. If, according to the Führer's decision, Germany is to acquire a position as a world power, she needs not only sufficient colonial possessions, but also secure naval communications and secure access to the ocean. 2. Both requirements can only be fulfilled in opposition to Anglo-French interests and would limit their position as world powers. It is unlikely that they can be achieved by peaceful means. The decision to make Germany a world power, therefore, forces upon us the necessity of making the corresponding preparations for war. 3. War against England means at the same time war against the Empire, against France, probably against Russia as well, and a large number of countries overseas. In fact, against half to 1/3 of the world. It can only be justified and have a chance of success, and it was not moral justification which was being looked for in this document. It can only be justified and have a chance of success if it is prepared economically as well as politically and militarily, and waged with the aim of conquering for Germany an outlet to the ocean.
I think the tribunal would like to know at what stage you propose to put the documents which you are citing in evidence.
Well, sir, my colleagues, my American and my British colleagues, were proposing to follow up my own address by putting these documents in. The first series of documents, which will be put in by my learned friend Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, will be the treatise.
Suppose that what you quote now will have to be read again.
Well, I'm limiting my quotations as far as I possibly can. I apprehend that technically you may wish it to be quoted again so as to get on the record when the document is actually put into evidence. But I think it will appear when the documents themselves are produced that there will be a good deal more in most of them than I'm actually citing now.
Yes.
This document on naval warfare against England is something which is both significant and new. Until this date, the documents in our possession disclose preparations for war against Poland, England, and France, purporting on the face of them at least, to be defensive measures, to ward off attacks which might result from the intervention of those States in the preparatory German aggressions in Central Europe. Hitherto, aggressive war against Poland, England, and France had been contemplated only as a distant objective. Now, in this document, for the first time, we find a war of conquest by Germany against France and England openly recognized as the future aim, at least of the German Navy. On the 24th of November of 1938, an appendix was issued by Keitel to a previous order of the Führer, and in that appendix were set out the future tasks for the armed forces and the preparation for the conduct of the war which would result from those tasks. The Führer has ordered, I quote, that besides the three eventualities mentioned in the previous directive, preparations are also to be made for the surprise occupation by German troops of the Free State of Danzig. For the preparation, the following principles are to be borne in mind. And this is the common pattern of aggression. The primary assumption is the lightning seizure of Danzig by exploiting a favorable political situation and not war with Poland. Troops which are going to be used for this purpose must not be held at the same time for the seizure of Memel land, so that both operations can take place simultaneously should necessity arise. And thereafter, as the evidence which is already before the tribunal has shown, final preparations were taking place for the invasion of Poland. On the 3rd of April of 1939, 3 days before the issue of the Anglo-Polish communique, the defendant Keitel issued to the High Command of the Armed Forces a directive in which it was stated that the directive for the uniform preparation of war by the armed forces in 1939-40 was being reissued, and that part relating to Danzig would be out in April. The basic principles were to remain the same as in the previous directive, and attached to this document were the orders Fall Weiss, the code name for the proposed invasion of Poland. Preparation for that invasion was to be made, it was stated, so that the operation could be carried out at any time from the 1st September 1939 onwards. On the 11th of April, Hitler issued his directive for the uniform preparation of the war by armed forces 1939-40. And in it he said, I shall lay down in a later directive future tasks of the armed forces and the preparations to be made in accordance with these for the conduct of war. Until that directive comes into force, the armed forces must be prepared for the following eventualities. 1, safeguarding of the frontiers. 2, Fall Weiss. 3, the annexation of Danzig. And then in an annex to that document, which bore the heading Political Hypotheses and Aims, it was stated that quarrels with Poland should be avoided, but should Poland change her policy, and adopt a threatening attitude towards Germany, a final settlement would be necessary, notwithstanding the Polish Pact. The free city of Danzig was to be incorporated in the Reich at the outbreak of the conflict at the latest. The policy aimed at limiting the war to Poland, and this was considered possible at that time with the internal crisis in France and resulting British restraint. The wording of that document, and the tribunal will study the whole of it, doesn't directly involve the intention of immediate aggression. It's a plan of attack if Poland changes her policy and adopts a threatening attitude. But the picture of Poland, with her wholly inadequate armaments, threatening Germany, now armed to the teeth, is ludicrous enough. And the real aim of the document emerges in the sentence. And I quote, "The aim is then to destroy Polish military strength and to create in the East a situation which satisfies the requirements of defense." The evidence doesn't suffice to prove that the actual decision to attack Poland on any given date had yet been taken. All the preparations were being set in train. All the necessary action was being proceeded with in case that decision should be reached. It was within 3 weeks of the issue of that last document that Hitler addressed the Reichstag on the 28th of April 1939. In that speech, he repeated the demands which had already been made upon Poland and proceeded to denounce the German-Polish agreement of 1934. Leaving aside, for the moment, the warlike preparations for aggression which Hitler had set in motion behind the scenes, I'll ask the tribunal to consider the nature of this denunciation of an agreement to which in the past Hitler had attached such importance. In the first place, of course, Hitler's denunciation was per se ineffectual. The text of the agreement made no provision for its denunciation by either party until the period of 10 years had come to an end. No denunciation could be legally effective until June or July of 1943, and here was Hitler speaking in April of 1939, almost rather more than 5 years too soon. In the second place, Hitler's actual attack upon Poland, when it came on September the 1st, was made before the expiration of the 6 months period after denunciation required by the agreement before any denunciation could be operative. And in the third place, the grounds for the denunciation stated by Hitler in his speech to the Reichstag were entirely specious. However one reads its terms, it is impossible to take the view that the Anglo-Polish guarantee of mutual assistance against aggression could render the German-Polish pact null and void, as Hitler sought to suggest. If that had been the effect of the Anglo-Polish assurances, then certainly the pacts which had already been entered into by Hitler himself with Italy, with Japan, had already invalidated the treaty with Poland. Hitler might have spared his breath. The truth is, of course, that the text of the German-Polish communique, text of the assurances, contains nothing whatever to support the contention that the German-Polish pact was in any way interfered with. And one asks, why then did Hitler make this trebly invalid attempt to denounce his own pet diplomatic child? Is there any other possible answer but that the agreement having served its purpose, the grounds which he chose for its denunciation were chosen merely in an effort to provide Germany with some kind of justification, at least for the German people, for the aggression on which the German leaders were intent. And of course, Hitler sorely needed some kind of justification, some apparently decent excuse, since nothing had happened and nothing seemed likely to happen from the Polish side to provide him with any kind of pretext for invading Poland. So far, he had been making demands upon his treaty partner, which Poland, as a sovereign state, had every right to refuse. If dissatisfied with that refusal, Hitler was bound, under the terms of the agreement itself, to seek a settlement, I'm reading the words of the pact, to seek a settlement through other peaceful means without prejudice to the possibility of applying those methods of procedure in case of necessity which are provided for such a case in the other agreements between them that are in force. And that presumably was a reference to the German-Polish arbitration treaty signed in Locarno in 1925. The very fact, therefore, that as soon as the Nazi leaders cannot get what they want, but are not entitled to, from Poland by merely asking for it, and that on their side they made no further attempt to settle the dispute by peaceful means, in accordance with the terms of the agreement and of the Kellogg Pact, to which the agreement pledged both parties, in itself constitutes a strong presumption of aggressive intention against Hitler and his associates now in the dock. That presumption becomes a certainty when the documents to which I'm about to call the attention of the tribunal are studied. On the 10th of May, Hitler issued an order for the capture of economic installations in Poland. On the 16th of May, the defendant Raeder, as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, issued a memorandum setting out the Führer's instructions to prepare for the operation Fall Weiss at any time from the 1st of September. But the decisive document is the record of the conference held by Hitler on May the 23rd, 1939. A conference with many high-ranking officers, including the defendants Goering, Raeder, and Keitel. The details of the whole document will have to be read to the tribunal later, and I merely summarize the substantial effect of this part of it now. Hitler stated that the solution of the economic problems with which Germany was said to be faced could not be found without invasion of foreign states and attacks on foreign property. Danzig, and I'm quoting, Danzig is not the subject of the dispute at all. It is a question of expanding our living space in the East. There is therefore no question of sparing Poland, and we are left with the decision to attack Poland at the earliest opportunity. We cannot expect a repetition of the Czech affair. There will be war. Our task is to isolate Poland. The success of this isolation will be decisive. The isolation of Poland is a matter of skillful politics. So he explained to his confederates. He anticipated the possibility that war with France and with England might result, but a two-front war was to be avoided if possible. Yet England was recognized, and I say it with pride, as the most dangerous enemy which Germany had. England, he said, and I quote, England is the driving force against Germany. The aim will always be to force England to her knees. And more than once he repeated that war with England and France would be a life and death struggle, but all the same, he concluded that Germany would not be forced into war, but she would not be able to avoid one. On the 14th of June of 1939, General Blaskowitz, then Commander-in-Chief of the Third Army Group, issued a detailed battle plan for the Fall Weiss. Following day, von Brauchitsch issued a memorandum in which it was stated that the object of the impending operation was to destroy the Polish armed forces. High policy demands, he said, high policy demands that the war should be begun by heavy surprise blows in order to achieve quick results. The preparations proceeded apace. On the 22nd of June, the defendant Keitel submitted a preliminary timetable for the operation, which Hitler seems to have approved and suggested that the scheduled maneuver might be camouflaged, must be camouflaged, in order not to disquiet the population. On the 3rd of July, Brauchitsch wrote to the defendant Raeder, urging that certain preliminary naval moves should be abandoned in order not to prejudice the surprise of the attack. On the 12th and 13th of August, Hitler and Ribbentrop had a conference with Ciano, the Italian foreign minister. It's a conference to which the tribunal will have to have regard from several points of view. I summarize now only one aspect of the matter. At the beginning of the conversation, Hitler emphasized the strength of the German position, of Germany's western and eastern fortifications, of the strategic and other advantages they held in comparison with those of England and France and Poland. And now I quote from the captured document itself. Hitler said this: "Since the Poles, through their whole attitude, had made it clear that in any case, in the event of a conflict, they would stand on the side of the enemies of Germany and Italy. A quick liquidation at the present moment could only be of advantage for the unavoidable conflict with the Western democracies. If a hostile Poland remained on Germany's eastern frontier, not only would the 11 East Prussian divisions be tied down, but also further contingents would be kept in Pomerania and Silesia. This would not be necessary in the event of a previous liquidation. And then this. Generally speaking, the best thing to happen would be for the neutrals to be liquidated one after the other. This process could be carried out more easily if on every occasion one partner of the Axis covered the other whilst it was dealing with an uncertain neutral. Italy might well regard Yugoslavia as a neutral of that kind. Italy wasn't ready. She believed that a conflict with Poland would develop into a general European war. Mussolini was convinced that conflict with the Western democracies was inevitable, but he was making plans for a period 2 or 3 years ahead. But the Führer said the Danzig question must be disposed of one way or the other by the end of August. And I quote, "He had therefore decided to use the occasion of the next Polish provocation in the form of an ultimatum." On the 22nd of August, Hitler called his supreme commanders together and gave orders for the attack. In the course of what he said, he made it clear that the decision to attack had in fact been made not later than the previous spring. He would give a spurious cause for starting the war, and at that time, the attack was timed to take place in the early hours of the 26th of August. On the day before, on the 25th of August, the British government, in the hope that Hitler might still be reluctant to plunge the world into war, and in the belief that a formal treaty would impress him more than the informal assurances which had previously been given, entered into an agreement, an express agreement, for mutual assistance with Poland, embodying the previous assurances that had been given earlier in the year. It was known to Hitler that France was bound by the Franco-Polish Treaty of 1921 and by the Guarantee Pact signed at Locarno in 1925 to intervene in Poland's favor in case of aggression. And for a moment, Hitler hesitated. The defendants Goering and Ribbentrop, in the interrogations which you will see, have agreed that it was the Anglo-Polish Treaty which led him to call off, or rather to postpone, the attack which was timed for the 26th. Perhaps he hoped that, after all, there was still some chance of repeating what he had called the Czech affair. If so, his hopes were short-lived. On the 27th of August, Hitler accepted Mussolini's decision not at once to come into the war, but he asked for propaganda support and for a display of military activity on the part of Italy so as to create uncertainty in the minds of the Allies. Ribbentrop on the same day said that the armies were marching. In the meantime, and of course particularly during the last month, desperate attempts were being made by the Western powers to avert war. You'll have details of them in evidence. Of the intervention of the Pope, of President Roosevelt's message, of the offer by the British Prime Minister to do our utmost to create the conditions in which all the matters in issue could be the subject of free negotiation and to guarantee the resultant decisions. But this and all the other efforts of honest men to avoid the horror of a European conflict were predestined to failure. The Germans were determined that the day for war had come. On the 31st of August, Hitler issued a top-secret order for the attack to commence in the early hours of the 1st September. The necessary frontier incidents duly occurred. Was it perhaps for that the defendant Keitel had been instructed by Hitler to supply Heydrich with Polish uniforms? And so, without a declaration of war, without even giving the Polish government an opportunity of seeing Germany's final demands, and you'll hear the evidence of the extraordinary diplomatic negotiations, if one can call them such, that took place at Berlin. Without giving the Poles any opportunity at all of negotiating or arbitrating on the demands which Nazi Germany was making, the Nazi troops invaded Poland. On the 3rd of September, Hitler sent a telegram to Mussolini thanking him for his intervention, but pointing out, I quote, that the war was inevitable and that the most promising moment had to be picked after cold deliberation. And so Hitler and his confederates, now before this tribunal, began the first of their wars of aggression for which they had prepared so long and so thoroughly. They waged it so fiercely that within a few weeks Poland was overrun. On the 23rd of November of 1939, Hitler reviewed the situation to his military commanders. And in the course of what he said, he made this observation. 1 year later, Austria came. This step was also considered doubtful. It brought about a tremendous reinforcement of the Reich. The next step was Bohemia, Moravia, and Poland. This step also was not possible to accomplish in one campaign. First of all, the western fortifications had to be finished. Then followed the creation of the Protectorate, and with that, the basis for action against Poland was laid. But I wasn't quite clear at that time whether I should start first against the East and then in the West, or vice versa. The decision came to fight with Poland first. one might accuse me of wanting to fight again and again. In struggle, I see the fate of all human beings. He wasn't sure where to attack first, but that sooner or later he would attack, whether it were in the east or in the west, was never in doubt. And he had been warned, not only by the British and French prime ministers, but even by his own confederate Mussolini, that an attack on Poland would bring England and France into the war. He chose what he thought was the opportune moment, and he struck. In those circumstances, the intent to wage war against England and France and to precipitate it by an attack on Poland is not to be denied. Here was defiance of the most solemn treaty obligations. Here was neglect of the most pacific assurances. Here was aggression, naked and unashamed, which was to arouse the horrified and heroic resistance of all civilized peoples, but which, before it was finished, was to tear down much of the structure of our civilization. Once started upon the active achievement of their plan to secure the domination of Europe, if not of the world, the Nazi government proceeded to attack other countries as occasion offered. The first actually to be attacked, actually to be invaded, after the attack upon Poland, were Denmark and Norway. On the 9th of April 1940, the German armed forces invaded Norway and Denmark without any warning, without any declaration of war. It was a breach of the Hague Convention. It was a breach of the Convention of Arbitration and Conciliation signed between Germany and Denmark on the 2nd of June 1926. It was, of course, a breach of the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1928. It was a violation of the non-aggression treaty between Germany and Denmark, made on the 31st of May of 1939. And it was a breach of the most explicit assurances which had been given. After his annexation of Czechoslovakia had shaken the confidence of the world, Hitler attempted to reassure the Scandinavian states. On the 28th of April 1939, he affirmed that he had never made any request to any of them which was incompatible with their sovereignty and independence. And on the 31st of May, he signed the non-aggression pact with Denmark. On the 2nd of September of 1939, the day after he had invaded Poland and occupied Danzig, he again expressed his determination, so he said, to observe the inviolability and integrity of Norway. And this was recorded in an aide-memoire which was handed to the Norwegian minister by the German minister in Oslo on that day. A month later, in a public speech on the 6th of October 1939, he said, Germany has never had any conflicts of interest or even points of controversy with the northern states. Neither has she any today. Sweden and Norway have both been offered non-aggression pacts by Germany and have both refused them solely because they do not feel themselves threatened in any way. When the invasion of Denmark and Norway was already begun, on the early morning of the 9th of April of 1940, a German memorandum was handed to the governments of those countries attempting to justify the German action. Various allegations against the governments of the invaded countries were made. It was said that Norway had been guilty of breaches of neutrality. It was said that she had allowed and tolerated the use of her territorial waters by Great Britain. It was said that Britain and France were themselves making plans to invade and occupy Norway, and that the government of Norway was prepared to acquiesce in such an event. I don't propose to argue the question whether or not these allegations were true or false. That question is irrelevant to the issues before this court. Even if the allegations were true, they were patently false, but even if they were true, they would afford no conceivable justification for the action of invading without warning, without declaration of war, without any attempt at mediation or conciliation. Aggressive war is nonetheless aggressive war because the state which wages it believes that other states might in the future take similar action. Rape of a nation isn't justified because it is thought that she may be raped by another, and nor even in self-defense are warlike measures justified except after all means of mediation have been tried and failed, and force is actually being exercised against the state concerned. But the matter is irrelevant because, in actual fact, with the evidence which we now possess, it is abundantly clear that the invasion of these two countries was undertaken for quite different purposes. It had been planned long before any question of breach of neutrality or occupation of Norway by England could ever have occurred. And it is equally clear that the assurances repeated again and again throughout 1939 were made for no other purpose but to lull suspicion in these countries and to prevent them taking steps to resist the attack against them, which was all along in active preparation. For some years, the defendant Rosenberg, in his capacity as chief of the Foreign Affairs Bureau, the APA, of the NSDAP, had interested himself in the promotion of fifth column activities in Norway. And he had established close relationship with the Nationalsammlung, a political group headed by the now notorious traitor Vidkun Quizling. During the winter of 1938-39, APA was in contact with Quizling, and later Quizling conferred with Hitler and with the defendants Raeder and Rosenberg. In August 1939, a special 14-day course was held at the School of the Office of Foreign Relations in Berlin for 25 followers whom Quizling had selected to attend it. The plan was to send a number of selected and reliable men to Germany for a brief military training in an isolated camp. These reliable men were to be the area and language specialists to German special troops who were taken to Oslo on coal barges to undertake political action in Norway. The object was a coup in which Quizling would seize his leading opponents in Norway, including the king, and prevent all military resistance from the beginning. Simultaneously with those fifth column activities, Germany was making her military preparations. On the 2nd of September of 1939, as I said, Hitler had assured Norway of his intention to respect her neutrality. On the 6th October, he said that the Scandinavian states were not menaced in any way. Yet on the 3rd October, the defendant Raeder was pointing out that the occupation of bases, if necessary by force, would greatly improve the German strategic position. On the 9th of October, Dönitz was recommending Trondheim as the main base, with Narvik as an alternative base for fuel supplies. The defendant Rosenberg was reporting shortly afterwards on the possibility of a coup d'etat by Quizling, immediately supported by German military and naval forces. On the 12th of December 1939, the defendant Raeder advised Hitler, in the presence of the defendants Keitel and Jodl, that if Hitler was favorably impressed by Quizling, the OKW should prepare for the occupation of Norway, if possible with Quizling's assistance, but if necessary entirely by force. Hitler agreed, but there was a doubt whether action should be taken against the Low Countries or against Scandinavia first. Weather conditions delayed the march on the Low Countries. In January of 1940, instructions were given to the German Navy for the attack on Norway. On March the 1st, a directive for the occupation was issued by Hitler. The general object was not said to be to prevent occupation by English forces, but in vague and general terms, to prevent British encroachment in Scandinavia and the Baltic, and to guarantee our ore bases in Sweden, and to give our Navy and Air Force a wider start line against Britain. But the directive went on. and here is the common pattern. On principle, we will do our utmost to make the operation appear as a peaceful occupation, the object of which is the military protection of the Scandinavian states. It is important that the Scandinavian states, as well as the Western opponents, should be taken by surprise by our measures. In case the preparations for embarkation can no longer be kept secret, the leader and the troops will be deceived with fictitious objectives. The form and the success of the invasion are well known. In the early hours of the 9th of April, 7 cruisers and 14 destroyers and a number of torpedo boats and other small craft carried advance elements of 6 divisions, totaling about 10,000 men, forced an entry and landed troops in the outer Oslo fjord, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik. A small force of troops was also landed at Arendal and Egersund on the southern coast. In addition, airborne troops were landed near Oslo and Stavanger on aerodromes. German attack came as a complete surprise. All the invaded towns along the coast were captured according to plan and with only slight losses. Only the plan to capture the king and Parliament failed. But brave as was the resistance, which was hurriedly organized throughout the country, nothing could be done in the face of the long-planned surprise attack, and on the 10th of June, military resistance ceased. And so, another act of aggression was brought to completion. Almost exactly a month after the attack on Norway, on the 10th of May 1940, the German armed forces, repeating what had been done 25 years before, streamed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, according to plan. A plan, that is, of invading without warning and without any declaration of war. What was done was, of course, a breach of the Hague Convention, and it's so charged. It was a violation of the Locarno Agreement of 1925, which the Nazi government affirmed in 1935, only legally to repudiate it a couple of years later. By that agreement, all questions incapable of settlement by ordinary diplomatic means were to be referred to arbitration. You'll see the comprehensive terms of all these treaties. It was a breach of the Treaty of Arbitration and Conciliation signed between Germany and the Netherlands on the 20th of May of 1926. It was a breach of the similar treaty with Luxembourg of the 11th September 1929. It was a breach of the Briand-Kellogg Pact. Those treaties, perhaps, had not derived in the minds of the Nazi rulers of Germany any added sanctity from the fact that they'd been concluded solemnly enough by the governments of pre-Nazi Germany. So let us just look at the specific assurances and undertakings which the Nazi rulers themselves gave to these states which lay in the way of their plans against France and England, and which they'd always intended to attack. Not once, not twice, but 11 times, the clearest possible assurances were given to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. On those assurances, solemnly given, formally expressed, these countries were entitled to rely and did rely. And in respect of the breach of those assurances, these defendants are charged. On the 30th of January of 1937, for instance, Hitler had said, "As for the rest, I have more than once expressed the desire and the hope of entering into similar good and cordial relations with our neighbors. Germany has, and here I repeat this solemnly, given the assurance time and time again that, for instance, between her and France, there cannot be any humanly conceivable points of controversy. The German government has further given the assurance to Belgium and Holland that it is prepared to recognize and guarantee the inviolability and neutrality of these territories." After Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland and had repudiated the Locarno Pact, England and France sought to re-establish the position of security for Belgium, which Hitler's action had threatened. And they therefore gave to Belgium on the 24th of April of 1937 a specific guarantee that they would maintain in respect of Belgium undertakings of assistance which they had entered into with her both under the Locarno Pact and under the Covenant of the League. On the 13th October 1937, the German government also made a declaration assuring Belgium of its intention to recognize the integrity of that country. It's perhaps convenient to deal with the remaining assurances as I review the evidence which is available as to the preparation and intention of the German government prior to the actual invasion on the 10th of May 1940. On the 6th of April 1941, German armed forces invaded Greece and Yugoslavia. Again, the blow was struck without warning and with the cowardice and deceit which the world now fully expected from the self-styled Herrenvolk. It was a breach of the Hague Convention. It was a breach of the Pact of Paris. It was a breach of a specific assurance given by Hitler on the 6th of October 1939. He said this: "Immediately after the completion of the Anschluss, I informed Yugoslavia that from now on, the frontier with this country will also be an unalterable one, and that we only desire to live in peace and friendship with her." But the plan of aggression against Yugoslavia had, of course, been in hand well before that. In the aggressive action eastward towards the Ukraine and the Soviet territories, security of the southern flank and the lines of communication had already been considered by the Germans. The history of the events leading up to the invasion of Yugoslavia by Germany is well known. At 3 o'clock in the morning of the 28th of October of 1940, a 3 our ultimatum had been presented by the Italian government to the Greek government, and the presentation of that ultimatum was immediately followed by the aerial bombardment of Greek provincial towns and the advance of Italian troops into Greek territory. The Greeks were not prepared. They were at first forced to withdraw. But later the Italian advance was at first checked, then driven towards the Albanian frontier, and by the end of 1940, the Italian army had suffered severe reverses at Greek hands. Of the German position in the matter, there is, of course, the evidence of what occurred when, on the 12th of August 1939, Hitler had his meeting with Ciano. You'll remember that Hitler said then, generally speaking, the best thing to happen would be for the neutrals to be liquidated one after the other. This process could be carried out more easily if on every occasion one partner of the Axis covered the other while it was dealing with an uncertain neutral. Italy might well regard Yugoslavia as a neutral of that kind. And then the conference went on, and it met again on the 13th of August. And in the course of lengthy discussions, Hitler said this: "In general, however, on success by one of the Axis partners, not only strategical but also psychological strengthening of the other partner, and also of the whole Axis, would ensue. Italy carried through a number of successful operations in Abyssinia, Spain and Albania, and each time against the wishes of the Democratic Entente. These individual actions have not only strengthened Italian local interests, but have also reinforced her general position. The same was the case with German action in Austria and Czechoslovakia. The strengthening of the Axis by these individual operations was of the greatest importance for the unavoidable clash with the Western powers." And so once again we see the same procedure being followed. That meeting had taken place on the 12th and the 13th of August of 1939. Less than 2 months later, Hitler was giving his assurance to Yugoslavia that Germany only desired to live in peace and friendship with her, with the very state, the liquidation of which by his Axis partner he had himself so recently suggested. Then came the Italian ultimatum to Greece and war against Greece, and the Italian reverse. And we have found amongst the captured documents an undated letter from Hitler to Mussolini, which must have been written about the time of the Italian aggression against Greece. "Permit me," Hitler said, "at the beginning of this letter to assure you that within the last 14 days my heart and my thoughts have been more than ever with you. Moreover, Duce, be assured of my determination to do everything on your behalf which might ease the present situation for you. when I asked you to receive me in Florence, I undertook the trip in the hope of being able to express my views prior to the beginning of the threatening conflict with Greece, about which I had only received general information. First, I wanted to request you to postpone the action, if at all possible, until a more favorable time of the year. At all events, until after the American presidential election. But in any case, however, I wanted to request you, Duce, not to undertake this action without a previous lightning-like occupation of Crete. And for this purpose, I also wanted to submit to you some practical suggestions in regard to the employment of a German parachute division and a further airborne division. Yugoslavia must become disinterested, if possible, however, from our point of view, interested in cooperating in the liquidation of the Greek question. Without assurances from Yugoslavia, it is useless to risk any successful operation in the Balkans. Unfortunately, I must stress the fact that waging a war in the Balkans before March is impossible. Hence, it would also serve to make any threatening influence upon Yugoslavia of no purpose, since the Serbian General Staff is well aware of the fact that no practical action could follow such a threat before March. Hence, Yugoslavia must, if at all possible, be won over by other means and in other ways. On the 12th of November of 1939, in his top-secret order, Hitler ordered the OKH to make preparations to occupy Greece and Bulgaria, if necessary. Apparently, 10 divisions were to be used in order to prevent Turkish intervention. I think I said 1939. It should, of course, have been the 12th of November, 1940. And to shorten the time, the German divisions in Romania were to be increased. On the 13th of December, Hitler issued an order to OKW, OKL and OKH, OKM and the General Staff on the Operation Marita, as the invasion of Greece was to be called. And in that order it was stated that the invasion of Greece is planned and is to commence as soon as the weather was advantageous. Further order was issued on the 11th of January of 1941. On the 28th of January of 1941, Hitler saw Mussolini. The defendants, Jodl, Keitel, and Ribbentrop, were present at the meeting. We know about it from Jodl's notes of what took place. We know that Hitler stated that one of the purposes of German troop concentrations in Romania was for use in the Plan Marita against Greece. On the 1st of March 1941, German troops entered Bulgaria and moved towards the Greek frontier. In the face of this threat of an attack on Greece by German as well as Italian forces, British troops were landed in Greece on the 3rd of March. In accordance with the declaration which had been given by the British government on the 13th of April 1939, that Britain would feel bound to give Greece and Romania, respectively, all the support in her power in the event of either country becoming the victim of aggression and resisting such aggression. Already, of course, the Italian operations had made that pledge operative. On the 25th of March of 1941, Yugoslavia, partly won over by the other means and other ways to which Hitler had referred, joined the three-power pact which had already been signed by Germany, Italy, and Japan. The preamble to the pact stated that the three powers would stand side by side and work together. On the same day, the defendant Ribbentrop wrote two notes to the Yugoslav Prime Minister assuring him of Germany's full intention to respect the sovereignty and independence of his country. That declaration was just another example of the treachery employed by German diplomacy. We've already seen the preparations that had been made. We've seen Hitler's attempts to tempt the Italians into an aggression against Yugoslavia. We've seen in January his own orders for preparations to invade Yugoslavia and Greece. And now on the 25th of March, he is signing a pact with that country, and his foreign minister is writing assurances of respect for her sovereignty and territorial integrity. As a result of the signing of that pact, the anti-Nazi element in Yugoslavia immediately accomplished a coup d'etat and established a new government. And thereupon, no longer prepared to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of her ally, Germany immediately took the decision to invade. On the 27th of March, 2 days after the three-power pact had been signed, Hitler issued instructions that Yugoslavia was to be invaded and used as a base for the continuance of the combined German and Italian operation against Greece. Following that, further deployment and instructions for the action Marita were issued by von Brauchitsch on the 30th of March of 1941. It was said, and I quote, "The orders issued with regard to the operation against Greece remain valid so far as not affected by this order. On the 5th April, weather permitting, the air forces are to attack troops in Yugoslavia, while simultaneously the attack of the 12th Army begins against both Yugoslavia and Greece." And as we now know, the invasion actually commenced in the early hours of the 6th of April. Treaties, pacts, assurances, obligations of any kind are brushed aside and ignored wherever the aggressive interests of Germany are concerned. I turn now to the last act of aggression in Europe. My American colleagues will deal with the position in relation to Japan. I turn now to the last act of aggression in Europe with which these Nazi conspirators are charged, the attack upon Russia. In August of 1939, Germany, although undoubtedly intending to attack Russia at some convenient opportunity, concluded a treaty of non-aggression with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. When Belgium and the Low Countries were occupied and France collapsed in June of 1940, England, although with the inestimably valuable moral and economic support of the United States of America, was left alone in the field as the sole representative of democracy in the face of the forces of aggression. At that moment, only the British Empire stood between Germany and the achievement of her aim to dominate the Western world. Only the British Empire and England as its citadel. But it was enough. The first and possibly the decisive military defeat which the enemy sustained was in the campaign against England. And that defeat had a profound influence on the future course of the war. On the 16th of July of 1940, Hitler issued to the defendants Keitel and Jodl a directive which they found themselves unable to obey, a directive for the invasion of England. It started off, and Englishmen will forever be proud of it, by saying that since England, despite her militarily hopeless situation, shows no signs of willingness to come to terms, I have decided to prepare a landing operation against England and, if necessary, to carry it out. The aim is to eliminate the English homeland as a base for the carrying on of war against Germany. The preparations for the entire operation must be complete by mid-August. But the first essential condition for that plan was, and I quote, that the English Air Force must morally and actually be so far overcome that it does not any longer show considerable aggressive force against the German attack. The defendant Goering and his Air Force no doubt made the most strenuous efforts to realize that condition. But in one of the most splendid pages of our history, it was decisively defeated. And although the bombardment of England's towns and villages was continued throughout that dark winter of 1940-41, the enemy decided in the end that England was not to be subjugated by these means, and accordingly Germany turned back to the east. The first major aim unachieved. On the 22nd of June of 1941, German armed forces invaded Russia. Without warning, without declaration of war, It was, of course, a breach of the usual series of treaties. They meant no more in this case than they'd meant in the other cases. It was a violation of the Pact of Paris. It was a flagrant contradiction of the Treaty of Non-Aggression, which Germany and Russia had signed on the 23rd of August a year before. Hitler himself said, in referring to that agreement, that agreements were only to be kept as long as they served a purpose. The defendant Ribbentrop was more explicit. In an interview with the Japanese ambassador in Berlin on the 23rd of February 1941, he made it clear that the object of the agreement had merely been, so far as Germany was concerned, to avoid a two-front war. In contrast to what Hitler and Ribbentrop and the rest of them were planning within the secret councils of Germany, we know what they were saying to the rest of the world. On the 19th of July, Hitler spoke in the Reichstag. In these circumstances, he said, I considered it proper to negotiate as a first priority a sober definition of interest with Russia. It would be made clear once and for all what Germany believes she must regard as her sphere of interest to safeguard her future, and on the other hand, what Russia considers important for her existence. From this clear delineation of the sphere of interest, there followed the new regulation of Russo-German relations. Any hope that now, at the end of the term of the agreement, a new Russo-German tension could arise is childish. Germany has taken no step which would lead her outside her sphere of interest, nor has Russia. But England's hope to achieve an amelioration of her own position through the engineering of some new European crisis is, insofar as it is concerned with Russo-German relations, an illusion. English statesmen perceive everything somewhat slowly, but they too will learn to understand this in the course of time. The whole statement was, of course, a tissue of lies. It was not many months after it had been made that the arrangements for attacking Russia were put into hand. And the defendant Raeder gives us the probable reason for the decision in a note which he sent to Admiral Assmann. The fear that control of the air over the Channel in the autumn of 1940 could no longer be attained, a realization which the Führer, no doubt, gained earlier than the Naval War Staff, who were not so fully informed of the true results of air raids on England, our own losses, surely caused the Führer, as far back as August and September, this was August and September of 1940, to consider whether, even prior to victory in the West, an eastern campaign would be feasible, with the object of first eliminating our last serious opponent on the continent. The Führer did not openly express this fear, however, until well into September. He may not have spoken to the Navy of his intentions until later in September, but by the beginning of that month, he had undoubtedly told the defendant Jodl about them. Dated the 6th of September 1940, we have a directive of the OKW signed by the defendant Jodl. Directions are given for the occupation forces in the east to be increased in the following weeks. For security reasons, and I'm quoting, this should not create the impression in Russia that Germany is preparing for an eastern offensive. Directives are given to the German intelligence service pertaining to the answering of questions by the Russian intelligence service. I quote, "The total strength of the German troops in the east is to be camouflaged by frequent changes in this area. The impression is to be created that the bulk of the troops in the south have moved, whilst the occupation in the north is only very small." And so we see the beginning of the operations. On the 12th of November of 1940, Hitler issued a directive signed by the defendant Jodl, in which it was stated that the political task to determine the attitude of Russia had begun, but that without reference to the result of preparations against the East, which had been ordered orally. It is not to be supposed that the USSR would have taken part in any conversations at that time if it had been realized that on the very day orders were being given for preparations to be made for the invasion of Russia, and that the order for the operation, which was called the Plan Barbarossa, was in active preparation. On the 16th November, the order was issued. I quote, "The German armed forces have to be ready to defeat Soviet Russia in a swift campaign before the end of the war against Great Britain." And later in the same instruction, and I quote again, "All orders which shall be issued by the high commanders in accordance with this instruction have to be clothed in such terms that they may be taken as measures of precaution in case Russia should change her present attitude towards ourselves." Germany kept up the pretense of friendliness. And on the 10th of January of 1941, well after the Plan Barbarossa had been, for the invasion of Russia, had been decided upon, Germany signed the German-Russia Frontier Treaty. Less than a month later, on the 3rd of February of 1941, Hitler held a conference attended by the defendants Keitel and Jodl, at which it was provided that the whole operation against Russia was to be camouflaged, as if it was part of the preparation for the sea lower, as the operation for the invasion of England was described. By March 1941, plans were sufficiently advanced to include provision for dividing the Russian territory into 9 separate states to be administered under Reich Commissars under the general control of the defendant Rosenberg. And at the same time, detailed plans for the economic exploitation of the country were made under the supervision of the defendant Goering to whom the responsibility in this matter, and it is a serious one, had been delegated by Hitler. You will hear something of the details of these plans. I remind you of one document which has already been referred to in this connection. It's significant that on the 2nd of May of 1941, a conference of state secretaries took place in regard to the Plan Barbarossa, and in the course of it, it was noted, one, that the war can only be continued if all armed forces are fed out of Russia in the 3rd year of the war. 2, there is no doubt that as a result, many millions of people will be starved to death if we take out of the country the things necessary for us. But that apparently caused no concern. The Plan Oldenburg, as the scheme for the economic organization and exploitation of Russia was described, went on. By the 1st of May 1941, the D-Day of the operation had been fixed. By the 1st of June, preparations were virtually complete and an elaborate timetable was issued. It was estimated that although there would be heavy frontier battles, lasting perhaps about 4 weeks, after that no serious opposition was to be expected. On the 22nd of June at 3:30 in the morning, the German armies marched again. And as Hitler said in his proclamation to them, I have decided to give the fate of the German people and of the Reich and of Europe again into the hands of our soldiers. The usual false pretexts were, of course, given. Ribbentrop stated on the 28th of June that the step was taken because of the threatening of the German frontiers by the Red Army. It was a lie, and the defendant, Ribbentrop, knew it was a lie. On the 7th of June 1941, Ribbentrop's own ambassador in Moscow was reporting to him, and I quote, that all observations show that Stalin and Molotov, who are alone responsible for Russian foreign policy, are doing everything to avoid a conflict with Germany. And the staff records, which you will see, make it clear that the Russians were making no military preparations, that they were continuing their deliveries under their trade agreements to the very last day. The truth is, of course, that the elimination of Russia as a political opponent and the incorporation of the Soviet territory in the German Lebensraum had been one of the cardinal features of Nazi policy for a very long time, subordinated latterly for what the defendant Jodl called diplomatic reasons. And so on the 22nd of June, the Nazi armies were flung against the power with which Hitler had so recently sworn friendship, and Germany embarked upon that last act of aggression in Europe, which, after long and bitter fighting, was eventually to result in Germany's own collapse. That then is the case against these defendants as amongst the rulers of Germany under Count 2 of this indictment. It may be said that many of the documents which have been referred to were in Hitler's name, that the orders were Hitler's orders, and that these men were mere instruments of Hitler's will. But they were the instruments without which Hitler's will could not be carried out. And they were more than that. These men were no mere willing tools, although they would be guilty enough if that had been their role. These are the men whose support had built Hitler up into the position of power he occupied. These are the men whose initiative and planning often conceived and certainly made possible the acts of aggression done in Hitler's name. And these are the men who enabled Hitler to build up the army, the navy, the air force, the war economy, the political philosophy by which these treacherous attacks were carried out, and by which he was able to lead his fanatical followers into peaceful countries, to murder, to loot, and to destroy. They are the men whose cooperation and support made the Nazi government of Germany possible. The government of a totalitarian country may be carried on without representatives of the people, but it cannot be carried on without any assistance at all. It is no use having a leader unless there are also people willing and ready to serve their personal greed and ambition by helping and following him. The dictator who is set up in control of the destinies of his country does not depend on himself alone, either in acquiring his power or in maintaining it. He depends upon the support and the backing which lesser men, themselves lusting to share in dictatorial power, anxious to bask in the adulation of their leader, are prepared to give him. In the criminal courts of our countries, when men are put upon their trial for breaches of the municipal laws, it not infrequently happens that of a gang indicted together in the dock, one has the mastermind, the leading personality. But it's no excuse for the common thief to say, I stole because I was told to steal. For the murderer to plead, I killed because I was asked to kill. And these men are in no different position, for all that it was nations which they sought to rob and whole peoples which they tried to kill. The warrant of no man excuseth the doing of an illegal act. Political loyalty, military obedience are excellent things, but they neither require nor do they justify the commission of patently wicked acts. There comes a point where a man must refuse to answer to his leader if he is also to answer to his conscience. Even the common soldier, serving in the ranks of his army, is not called upon to obey illegal orders. But these men were no common soldiers. They were the men whose skill and cunning, whose labor and activity made it possible for the German Reich to tear up existing treaties, to enter into new ones and to flout them, to reduce international negotiations and diplomacy to a hollow mockery, to destroy all respect for and effect in international law, and finally to march against the peoples of the world to secure that domination in which, as arrogant members of their self-styled master race, they profess to believe. If these crimes were in one sense the crimes of Nazi Germany, they also are guilty as the individuals who aided, abetted, counseled, procured, and made possible the commission of what was done. The total sum of the crime these men have committed...
Marshal, stop that noise up there. Go on, Mr. Turner.
The total sum of the crime these men have committed, so awful in its comprehension, has many aspects. Their lust and sadism, their deliberate slaughter, and the degradation of so many millions of their fellow creatures that the imagination reels, are but one side of this matter. Now that an end has been put to this nightmare, and we come to consider how the future is to be lived, perhaps their guilt as murderers and robbers is of less importance and less effect to future generations of mankind than their crime of fraud. The fraud by which they placed themselves in a position to do their murder and their robbery. That is the other aspect of their guilt. The story of their diplomacy, founded upon cunning, hypocrisy, bad faith, is a story less gruesome, no doubt, but no less evil and deliberate. And should it be taken as a precedent of behavior in the conduct of international relations, its consequences to mankind will no less certainly lead to the end of civilized society. Without trust and confidence between nations, without the faith that what is said is meant and that what is undertaken will be observed, all hope of peace and of security is dead. The governments of the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth, of the United States of America, of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and of France, backed by and on behalf of every other peace-loving nation of the world, have therefore joined to bring the inventors and perpetrators of this Nazi conception of international relationship before the bar of this tribunal. That these defendants may be punished for their crimes. They do so also that their conduct may be exposed in all its naked wickedness, and they do so in the hope that the conscience and good sense of all the world will see the consequences of such conduct and the end to which inevitably it must always lead. Let us once again restore sanity, and with it the sanctity of our obligations towards each other.